21st Century Entrepreneurship with Martin Piskarik.
When I started writing it, I definitely didn't expect to be launching sort of at the tail end of the pandemic. Doing a lot of sort of virtual conversations, just like everyone. When I really expected to be kind of flying around and meeting people face to face. But I mean, other than that, I mean, at least we get to still communicate.
What was your process? Did you use a Scrivener or something like that, ghostwriter, or any help? Or?
Oh yeah. I mean, if you really want to break it down, interestingly enough, so this is my 8th book. So I've written before through major publishers, O'Reilly, Pragmatic, and a couple of years ago, I had a kid. I had a baby, and I wanted to write a book for her, and so I wrote this book through a Kickstarter campaign called Computer Science for Babies, and it's like a cloth baby book, and it's got like Boolean logic in it and a teething ring. I mean, it's the kitschy kind of thing. But that was my first experience of actually trying to publish myself. And it was fine for that because of, cloth baby book is more like a toy than it is, an actual book. So there's no publishers for that. And so I thought, maybe publishers just aren't relevant anymore. And maybe I'm going to try to go. So actually, this is published under my own press. So it's Deep Tech, published under Deep Tech Press. It's very intentional because I'm just curious, like, what role do they play in a world where, most books are bought on Amazon or Apple Books or sort of these 2 or 3 major channels anyway, Barnes and Noble. And so, but I also knew that I'm not qualified to do everything myself. And so I actually employed a company called Scribe.
Scribe, yes.
The Tucker Max company. And, it was actually a really pretty good experience because I wrote the book and, the editors came in and they do what editors do. And, we have the typesetters and the layout artists and the cover artists. I mean, you say don't judge a book by its cover, but most people do. They'll look, and if the cover looks like garbage, they're not going to buy the book. So anyway, it was kind of a really interesting experience because rather than those people being supplied by the publisher, they were working for me and with me. And if I said, I don't want to do it this way, then they would be like, all right, we won't do it that way. A publisher, a lot of times they won't listen. They'll say, you don't have a choice or we'll cancel your contract. So it was a whole lot of fun.
How did you finance it?
I mean, in some ways I financed it with just spare money I had from like Bitcoin. I just because I actually believe in all of this tech that I talk about in the book. And in a lot of ways, in full transparency, it's like I invest in a lot of it. Not necessarily well. I mean, one of my claims to fame is the fact that it's like I bought a cup of coffee with a Bitcoin in 2013 in Beijing. And right now that would be like a $60,000 cup of coffee US. And so, but that just happens.
And what's the cookie after the whole process?
People always ask, like, why do you write books? It's like, because I can't imagine not doing it. It's just, I'm always writing. The idea of sort of the work and the effort for me is just collecting all that writing into a narrative that makes sense to other people. But for the most part, it's just doing it every single day, even when you don't want to. And so I know there's some people there's like, I have to write like 1,000 words a day every single day. I mean, that's fine. I don't tend to be that hard on myself. And it's always stops and starts. You just have to start again. It's like, I think a lot of times, like people look back and be like, I didn't do anything for 2 months. It's like sunk cost. It's over. Go back to it now.
personality traits, persistence. What else?
Oh yeah. Oh geez. I would tenacity. I would say tenacity is like the one superpower required for writing a book. Another. What is it? I think it's Tom Wolfe that was saying that it's like the big secret is that anyone can write a book. And it's true. It's like anybody can. But my joke is always that anybody can write one book. Not everybody can write 5. And to have a book that's actually good quality, you have to write it and rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it. So you'll end up having written like 5 books before you've published something. And so that's really the sticky part. I think a lot of people are like, well, the rough draft is the hardest part. The first draft, it's like, no, it's not. For me, the hardest part is killing the things you love the most of it. And this is where I think a great editor comes into mind. It's like I would say, it's like you're not a professional writer until you've had your heart ripped out by an editor, because they'll find that you're the thing you love the most, and they'll just be like, this doesn't work, get rid of it.
Any personal transformation during writing the book?
Yeah, in the sense that it's you become an expert, right? There's sort of, you can either be an expert and then take that expertise and write a book, or you can become an expert during the writing because you're learning and you're researching and you're doing all of that. I mean, I think they're both fine. But at the end, it's like you do know a lot. I mean, you learn a lot, because it's like most of the time, whatever's in the book is a small percentage of all the things you had to learn to make it. And this isn't just about my kind of book where it's sort of like where it's a sort of nonfiction, has a lot of technical information in it. It's even if it's just, you're writing something like deeply emotional or about society or something, you got to learn a lot about yourself or about your topic. My favorite description comes from Joshua Siegel, who is the founder of the Deep Tech Bootcamp at MIT. And his description is that deep tech was impossible yesterday, barely feasible today, and tomorrow will become so ubiquitous it's hard to imagine life without it. It's a fundamental reimagining of the world and how we interact with it. And an example could be like mobile phones, right? Smartphones. Like in 2007, this was deep tech, because in 2005, it wasn't possible. And here we are, in a decade later and more, and we can't even imagine a world without smartphones. It's like a perfect example of deep tech. What I found interesting in the impetus for this book was the realization that true deep tech is rare. Like it doesn't come all the time. I mean, economists, they'll call it a general purpose technology. So like electricity or the steam engine or something major like that. But right now, this decade, we're at the cusp of 7 transformational technologies, 7 enablers of deep tech. And I say enablers because it's not about the tech itself. It's not about AI. It's about deep tech is what AI can do. It's not about Internet of Things. Deep tech is about what IoT can do. And you take those two and you put them together, and suddenly you've got something that Satya Nadella from Microsoft calls the intelligent edge. So it's like that's where it gets really, really interesting, sort of the combinatorial creativity that comes out of all of these different things. Usually there'll be one thing, right? Smartphones. Think about how many industries that's disrupted. Now think about 7 smartphones all coming out in the same decade. It's like it's hard for us to even imagine what 2030 is going to be like, because you have AI, you've got Internet of Things, you've got extended reality like AR and VR. You've got blockchain, like cryptocurrencies and NFTs. You've got 3D printing, so additive manufacturing. You've got quantum computing there sort of at the tail end. And then you throw in sort of like autonomous robotics and like autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, things like that. And all of these are coming to a head. Like some of them are, obviously it's not a perfect side-by-side march, but some of them like AI are already here. IoT is already here. Some of them like self-driving cars and quantum computing are coming in the next 5 or so years. And just imagine the end of the decade. Like, I mean, AI is like this kind of crazy thing. Like right now, what's limiting AI is really computing power for the most part. Throw quantum computing onto AI and strap in. Like it's hard to even imagine where we're going to be a decade from now.
What would be regarding those 7 technologies, or you can choose any specific one? What would be your sweetest dream versus your nightmare scenario?
Yeah, for me, my favorite out of all of these are autonomous vehicles. I feel like more than many others, like additive manufacturing or something, or it's going to have the most immediate and obvious change when it happens. I mean, there's obvious plus sides. I mean, 1.3 million people die in automobile-related accidents every single year. So, I mean, that's more than all drugs, wars, and domestic violence all combined.
Wow!
And every single year, it's just that we just take for granted that that's the cost of transportation. So you've got these autonomous vehicles, these cars that eventually will be driving better than humans because they can relentlessly improve and get better and better and better, and they never stop paying attention. They don't get tired or don't get drunk or anything like this. And so, we'll be in this world where over 1 million people a year are saved. Like that's kind of an incredible thing, and that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg. And then you think about the fact that it's like. By some good estimates, when we have autonomous vehicles, 95% of a car's life is just sitting around, like sitting in a parking lot or a parking garage somewhere. And so suddenly, well, you don't need them to sit around, right? You've got a car that can drive off and pick someone else up, and then drive off and pick someone else up. So suddenly, the number of cars that have to exist in the world is reduced dramatically by like up to 40% by some estimates. So think about the carbon footprint reduction that'll have. Because the biggest one of the biggest parts of the carbon footprint of cars isn't just the driving them, but it's actually the manufacturing of them and the waste that comes out of them when they've hit their end of life. So reduce that by 40%, and that's a pretty big impact. So there's sort of all these like interesting, amazing things, like the way cities will be changed. And it's like, okay, now if a car is going to come pick me up whenever I need it, I don't need to own one. Now my garage is great. Now I've got a home gym. So suddenly like real estate starts changing from the personal level to the 30% of a city of your average city is spent on parking lots and parking garages. And it's like, oh, that can all be reclaimed for housing and business and all of this stuff. So it's just going to change the shape of cities and on and on and on. I think it's just amazing to me. That's probably the one I'm most excited about. The downside, and this is where things like, well, what could possibly be a downside of that? Well, a few. I mean, at least in the U.S., in 29 states, the number one job is transportation, truck driving, and now suddenly that's automated. Like through no fault of their own, these truck drivers are unemployable. Now people will say, well, we'll just train them to do other things. It's like, I know a lot of truck drivers, the 50s, 60s, they're not going to train to do anything else. Like they just can't. I mean, that's not that they can't, but it's like for what end? It's like they're going to spend 10 years cramming through college to become a computer programmer for, it just doesn't logistically work too well. So I think there's going to be a big unemployment related to that. And the other thing too, is you think about the sort of secondary and tertiary industries that exist to service that. It's like, okay, it's great that we're going to make 40% fewer cars, but that's also probably 40% fewer jobs in manufacturing factories and car parts and on and on and on. You drive down the road and you've got hotels and you've got diners, all these things for travelers to you pull off the side of the road. Well, what do you do when all of those people dry up? I mean, so those industries will start flittering. So I do think there's sort of this, we really have to be thinking now about what is going to be the impact of this amazing transformational technology. If you want to get really dark, 1.3 million fewer people dying a year sounds great. However, those deaths are actually our best source of organs for people that need organ transplants. And so suddenly all of these organs that are in the system are going to dry up. So if you've got kidney disease or liver or something like that, there's not going to be any donors. And so we have to sort of think through that. But then we get into this world of, okay, well, you know what, 3D printing, there's a lot of interesting work in 3D printing. That's right. And so that could be a solve for this. And so it's not that you can look at one thing in a vacuum and say, oh, this is going to be great or this is going to be bad. It's like you have to think through. And this is, again, the whole central conceit of the book is once you understand the sort of arc of all of these technologies that are coming, you can start thinking through scenarios of, well, this might be bad over here, but it might actually have a solve over here.
Is it a positive thing for you, or sometimes it's a stressful thing to take into consideration all those scenarios and think about 7 different technologies and their interaction, and about additive manufacturing and IoT and AI, etc.?
Yes and no. What I find is the way I deal with that is I just focus on educating and say, look, this technology shift that's happening this decade. Again, I can't stress that enough. This decade is different from any previous decade because most of the time there will be the introduction of a new technology or some major general purpose technology, some deep tech, but we've got a little bit of breathing room, right? We'll have a few years to sort of figure out what we want to do with it and all that. But it's like, this is not one of those decades. This is an outlier. I mean, it's sort of like in the way we weren't really ready for COVID, we weren't ready for this pandemic. We're not ready for all the changes that are happening with all this tech. And so I think it's easy to become sort of overwhelmed and either, fall into despair or exuberance either. I think that's equally as dangerous, sort of irrational exuberance. What I focus on is I don't think there's any one person that could possibly wrap their head around all of this. So I've just given up personally. I was like, it's just not possible. But I think if we can educate enough people that as a society, collectively, we can solve this and have new ideas. And so that's really what keeps me going. That's sort of the positive outlook I have on this.
Personally, do you think all those technologies will help you personally in your life?
Yeah. I mean, personally, geez. I mean, I just look around my house. Like I've got a 3D printer, and I've 3D printed widgets in my house. Like I've got an Apple TV that I couldn't get to stick to the wall, so I printed like a case for it and like drilled the case in and clicked it in. I mean, it just becomes part of your life, and suddenly, my kids will be like, oh, I want a little toy, and I'll just find a 3D model and I'll print it up and I'll hand it to them. And so those kind of things, they just start becoming natural. They just start becoming normal. Virtual reality, I on almost daily basis, I'm always in some kind of VR thing. AI, everybody uses AI. Like you can't even get away from it. If you've ever used Siri or Alexa or anything like that, you're using AI to some extent. If you've ever bought a plane ticket, those have been price managed by AI. If you've ever searched anything on Google, those searches have been curated for you on AI, Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. Like your life is like already surrounded by AI. So that's almost unavoidable. Obviously, I said like the autonomous vehicles thing I'm super excited about. I was an early Bitcoin investor. When I say investor, I mean I mine Bitcoin. I just forgot about it and I didn't sell it. And then it's like, oh, it's valuable now. That's fun. But for the most part, yeah, I mean, I personally, this is what I always tell people. It's like, if you want to really wrap your head around this stuff, go online, buy an Oculus, put on VR. You can't hear about VR. It's like being told what the taste of food is like. You've got to experience it or the words are meaningless. Go get some smartwatch, start doing some quantitative self tracking. I mean, I know what my blood pressure is and my sleep rate for the last like several years. I don't know what that data is good for, but maybe my doctors will find value in it in the future. They'll know what my baseline is, and it's like you're above normal or below normal.
What about our interaction and emotions, emotional maturity? Do you think it's good for the society, for human species, or?
I don't believe that any technology is inherently good or bad. I mean, it's inevitable, but I don't think it's good or bad. I think it just makes everything more powerful, right? Think about the technology to split the atom was not inherently good or bad. We created bombs, but we also created nuclear power. So it's like there's this balance for sure. It's fun to talk about the individual technologies, but that's not really the point. The point is technology is just a tool. And so I think the bright thing to think about this is understand those tools at sort of it doesn't have to be a deep level. You don't have to understand how a hammer is made to use a hammer. You just have to know what it's for and what it's good for. You put those tools together, and this is why I believe that everyone should understand these, because everyone is capable of being creative if you focus on what your specialty is, what your outcomes need to be. I remember hearing that the world doesn't want a better mousetrap. You heard this like, oh, the world wants a better mousetrap and they'll beat a path to your door. That's not true. The world doesn't care about mousetraps. What the world wants is an environment free of pests. That's what they want. So focus on that. Focus on that outcome, and once you know what your tools and capabilities are, it frees you from this constraint of thinking, how do I improve on a mousetrap? And instead think bigger and say, how do I create an environment that doesn't have pests in it? Because maybe the solution is not a mousetrap at all. Maybe the solution is a device that has a high-pitched squeal that just keeps rats away, and that's sufficient. That's fine. That you still get the outcome that you wanted. And so that's my only my only request is just understand the tech and then don't dwell on it. And just dwell on as I like to say at my work, is fall in love with the problem, not the solution. Cybernetics, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's all over. I mean, there's already people that are they're called biohackers, where they just sort of will inject like NFCs, near field communication chips, like inside their hand and things like that. There's this professor from MIT Media Lab, Fidelity, that's really big into sort of swallowable microchips that kind of go through your system, and it has all these reading, and they can use RFID to like get real-time like information as it's moving through your system, cameras and all of that. And another friend of mine, Amber Case, she actually gave a TED talk about 10 years ago, and the talk was we're all cyborgs now. And her argument was, look, being a cyborg is as much, it's about this convergence between your sort of physical organic self and electronics. And if you think about the fact that if you lose your phone, it's almost like losing an appendage. Like you kind of freak out. You're like, oh, like it's a part of your brain that's mapped to this phone as an extension of yourself. And when you look at it in that lens, it's like we're already well down the path. Like we know what it's like to be a cyborg now. It's a very short leap between this phone and maybe Google Glass on your face, which I wore for a year. And it was the same thing. I always knew what time it was because it was just hovering, this clock hovering in the air. And when I took it off, it was really disorienting. Like I always knew what time it was. And suddenly I was like missing something. Like so I ended up getting a watch because I was just like obsessively like, what time is it? It didn't matter. And other people were doing these things with like, directionality. There was a guy who had installed a magnet in his hand. and it would rotate towards north. And he always knew what direction it was. You just sort of get a sense of what direction north was. And he started being able to, like, he had like this perfect ability to navigate anywhere. Yeah. And so, I mean, that's really definitely the next level is inserting things. I mean, you look at Elon Musk and his Neuralink company, and, you know, they're trying to figure out how to do brain machine interfaces by inserting directly into your brain. That's really the next level, is the ability to sort of directly not only consume information, but also transmit information with your thoughts directly. Like everyone, this past year has been hard with the pandemic. And I think it's been especially hard on kids. And I've got 2 young kids, and they were feeling very, very trapped in their house. We don't have a yard. We're in a sort of brownstone kind of townhouse. A lot of this technology is really, really helpful for them. So I talked about, for example, 3D printing toys. They got to experiment in a lot of ways. So they found a lot of value in being able to sort of touch physical things rather than just looking at screens all day long. They're really big fans of virtual reality. Actually, when they first started going back to school virtually, my daughter did a chapter in her class on Egypt. And so we put on a virtual reality and like visited the pyramids virtually. And you could walk around, and, you know, there were camels and everything. And she was just enamored by it. And it made it more real for her than simply either reading about it or even watching a video on it. And suddenly, for about 3 months, like, Egypt was her favorite thing in the world, until she, you know, put on VR and then found that she could swim underwater with sharks. And it's like, oh man, sharks are the coolest things in the world. And so it's like, it really, really helps, I think. And I don't think that's going away. I mean, now, even though they can go outside, like, now VR is just part of their routine and part of their life. And I don't think they're unique in this. I think, and they're part of this whole new generation called Gen Alpha. It's sort of the next after Gen Z, which we think Gen Z are kids, but by 2025, 27% of the workforce will be Gen Z. So they're already coming out, they're graduating, they're getting married, having kids on their own. And so Gen Alpha is sort of this next up and coming generation. And they don't have a divide between their physical life and their digital life anymore. To them, it's all one and the same.
Really? Wow.
And yeah, well, and so knowing that, I think it helps us that are a little older, that used to have this divide, like we live in the real world and then we have our sort of digital online persona, to start getting in their heads, like understanding them a little bit better, to know that when we're thinking about, well, like, what's the workforce of the future? Well, they're going to expect this sort of premium digital experience that sort of blurs the lines between the physical and digital, because that's just what they're growing up with now. The one takeaway is that digital literacy isn't something you can rely on others for. If you're involved in leadership, setting goals, crafting strategies, anything, you have to be as familiar with the landscape of deep tech as you already are probably about other aspects of your business, like marketing or finance. So in this decade, it's a new basic requirement. We're all tech leaders now. And this book is just helping people take one step towards that reality.
21st Century Entrepreneurship with Martin Piskarik.